This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today, Jimmy Soni, Rob Goodman. One of those rare episodes where I get to have the co-authors of the same book on the show at the same time. And where these two men decided to go, where Jimmy and Rob have gone, there has been a need for this for a long time. The book, A Mind at Play, How Claude Shannon Invented the Information Age. That is no exaggeration. He was a groundbreaking polymath, brilliant tinkerer, digital pioneer. Just about everything that we use today traces back, at least technology, traces back to Claude Shannon. I give all the props to Jimmy and Rob for digging deep and bringing this very special man's life story to my podcast. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Jimmy Soni and Rob Goodman. So guys, today we're talking via Skype. You know, it's pretty ubiquitous today. Hey, speak on Skype, send an email, whatever. But there's one guy out there that none of us pay enough homage to. It's the ground zero, the start of all this. And you guys have put this wonderful book together. And I'm going to say from the top, and I'm not being paid for this, but if you've got half a brain cell still left, you must read this book, period. Because this is the starting point of just basic human logic. Well, it's not the starting point, but for the modern age, Claude Shannon is it. How did you guys come to fill this niche? I mean, look, anybody that looks at books and looks at titles out there knows that no one's done this book, and he didn't do an autobiography. So you guys grabbed the niche and ran with it. How did it start?
Well, thanks, Mike. That's incredibly high praise, and we really appreciate it and appreciate you having us on. I was reading a book about a company that'll be familiar to a lot of people. It's called Bell Labs, Bell Laboratories. In the 20th century, if you can imagine that Apple and Google joined forces, Bell Labs was still bigger than both of those entities put together. It was a powerhouse of innovation. They won 6 Nobel Prizes. They invented the fax machine, touch-tone dialing, the laser. I mean, this was just an incredible, fertile environment for innovation and entrepreneurship. And it was the second largest employer in the United States behind the Defense Department. And so one of the people who worked there was a guy named Claude Shannon. I had stumbled on the story of Bell Labs in a book called The Idea Factory. And I went looking for a biography of Claude Shannon, and I couldn't find it. And I was sort of gobsmacked that I couldn't find it because he was such an interesting, innovative figure, and there was so much that he did that's so important to our world today. So that's how we stumbled on the story, and then at a certain point, we just decided to go for it.
Let me just add real quick. So just to give people context right out of the gate, there would be no Skype. There'd be no internet. The MP3, the DVD, the transfer of information digitally. This guy's it. He's ground zero.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And Claude Shannon explained the mathematics and the engineering and laid the intellectual architecture that makes the entire information age and digital age possible. So I think that every day we take advantage of the fruits of Claude Shannon's labor. Every day we live in this world that he helped to lay the architecture for. But before we started researching this book, we weren't even aware that he existed. We weren't aware of his remarkable personality or his remarkable creative insight or his work habits that enabled him to do so much in a relatively short amount of time. So it's just been really gratifying to us to learn where all this comes from and to learn about the thought behind just making a Skype call, just sending an email, stuff that we would be prone to take for granted if we didn't investigate where it came from and just how much creativity went into laying the groundwork.
So we're only going to get so far in an hour conversation today. That's why I say at the very top, people really need to dig in and read. And you mentioned Bell Labs. By the way, the Kelly criteria, I believe, came out of Bell Labs too. And from a trading perspective, there's so much that's grounded in that. So a lot of interesting things there. But let's get into the very specifics too. Not as specific as you get in the book, but lay out for people perhaps those initial aha moments with Shannon. I mean, here's an engineer, and he's looking at switches and the controlling of electricity, the movement of it. And this guy's he's a tinkerer. He does his own thing. Frankly, the information age that we're talking about today, from what I understand from your work, he basically went into a solo room, produced it, and then said to the world, here it is. Give some groundwork so people understand what it was, his initial, and he had a very famous paper, but his initial finding and how he came to it.
Yeah, well, I'll say a couple of things. First of all, like you said, Claude Shannon was a tinkerer. He was a man that one of the engineers we spoke with said about him that Claude Shannon didn't just think about things, he thought through things. He thought through them by solving puzzles, by building gadgets with his hands. Ever since he was a kid and growing up in Michigan in the 1910s and 20s, he was someone who liked to make things, whether it was a telegraph in his backyard or remote control robots or so on. So when Claude Shannon sat down and thought about problem of transmitting information and the problem of coding information in a digital way so that we could send it accurately like we're doing over the Skype call, he was someone who brought to this engineering problem just a wealth of interests. There were interests in things like questions about the nature of language. What does it mean to send a message? What do we do when we communicate with one another? How predictable is a language? And then he brought to that not just his tinkering ability, but his ability to work with codes and cryptography, which was both a hobby of his and something that he did for the U.S. defense establishment during World War II. So I think what Shannon brought to the problem that a lot of people were working on, but what made his approach so unique was that he had such a wide overlapping range of interests. He was just so promiscuously curious about everything in his world that he brought to the problem of information a lot of out of left field insights that none of the people in the field, it hadn't even occurred to other people who were working in the same field as Shannon. So basically, when he worked on this information theory paper, a lot of time in his spare time over the course of roughly a decade, behind closed doors in his apartment, when he unveiled what he'd been working on, his boss at Bell Labs said it exploded onto the scene like a bomb. No one saw it coming. No one even imagined that Claude Shannon could not just create the entire field of information theory overnight, but solve most of its major problems at one blow, anticipating the digital world that we'd be living in long before there's anything like a modern computer or like a modern internet.
Let me let you guys go back to an example really quick. So back in the day, before we had all this digital communication, we're laying lines across the ocean floor to communicate from America and the UK. There's Morse code. There's other forms of sending information, but it was often unclear. And for example, somebody would send a message, and the person would have to repeat it. There was this need for redundancy, but there was also a lot of error. Clearly, that's why somebody was having to repeat. And Shannon, his novel thinking here, got around this idea of error. And of course, I'm talking about a phone cable across the Atlantic, and we extrapolate out today to a Skype conversation. But why don't you speak to that initial novel idea of taking information, reducing it to bits, and getting around this error problem?
Yeah, the major insight Shannon had was that it's not about talking louder, it's about talking smarter. And what I mean by that is that up until Shannon's time, the basic common sense solution said that there's going to be noise and inaccuracy and error in any kind of communication, and the best you can do is by pumping more energy into the system you're communicating over, which means maybe insulating the cable better or sending louder signals or just brute forcing it. Shannon's major insight, which really turned the field upside down, was the solution is not so much in pumping more energy into the communication system. It's in thinking more rigorously about our messages, encoding them in bits, and coming up with codes that can protect those bits from error, that can actually build extra redundancies into the code so that when errors happen, as they do transmitting a Skype call, for instance, it can be decoded on the other end in such a way that the essential quality of the message is preserved. It's all about thinking about how we encode and shape our messages for delivery, and not just about pumping energy into the medium of transmission. And that way of thinking about our messages and not just the wire we're sending them over was really the big bang in Shannon's theory. And that's what really turned the whole field upside down.
It's just an amazing, novel approach that we all take for granted today, but he was able to sit back and think about it. And I think you might want to address this as well, too. His brilliance with logic, his brilliance with engineering and circuit boards, his real brilliance that I can see in your work is the reduction to simplicity. He took the so complicated and was constantly reducing formulas down to their bare essence to make things usable for the front lines.
That's absolutely right. I think he would have been a great admirer of products that are like Apple products that are stripped down to their bare essentials. He was a big simplifier in the best sense. And part of what he did and part of what he taught was that complexity is the enemy. You want elegant mathematics, elegant proofs. He often skipped over a lot of the intervening work in his math in the interest of kind of getting to the point more quickly. And part of what he did was he started with the barest, biggest questions and built the complexity on top of those questions. And it's actually how he taught. And one of his graduate students gave this really great recollection. He came in with this math problem that he thought was just this extraordinarily complex, sophisticated problem, and he was going to solve it. And Claude Shannon was sort of sat there and listened to him and said, well, do you need that assumption? And this graduate student said, well, no, I guess I don't. And then Claude Shannon a few minutes later said, well, do you need this assumption? And he said, well, no, I don't really think I don't. And this went on for about a half hour, I think, where he just pulled out all of the pieces of this problem. And at this point, the graduate student's getting really frustrated because he said, I had this great complex problem and now he's picking it apart. But at the end of that session, what he realized is Claude Shannon had gotten him down to the bare essence of the problem. And then they started putting all of the assumptions back in, and it all became very, very clear. I think part of this gift was intuitive. I think that, Shannon had, like Einstein or Feynman, an ability to sort of see the ends of a problem in a way that a lot of people don't. But I think part of it, too, was that Claude Shannon was a son of the Midwest, and simple, practical things mattered a lot. He grew up in a town where they valued practicality. His dad was a furniture maker. He spent his boyhood making things that either worked or didn't work. And so I think there was some of the simplicity that came from nurture as well as nature.
You guys have this great line in your book to address what you just said, this quote, "Genius is rarely able to give an account of its own processes." And that sounds, that's obviously it's in your work, but it's Claude Shannon 101, isn't it?
It is. I wish we could take credit for the line. I think we had quoted George Henry Lewis, who actually said that about geniuses. But what's really interesting, just speaking to that line, is people who would meet Shannon would know that they were in the company of a genius. Students of his knew that they were speaking to a mind that was on par with the 20th century's best. And yet, Shannon never carried himself that way, which is actually one of the more interesting things about him, that in the 1950s, he became a kind of scientific celebrity. He was put in magazines and he was on TV. And then he just looked at all of that and he said, you know what, that's not what I want to do. I want to keep exploring. I want to keep doing my inventing and my tinkering. And he kind of walked away from it all. It's this extraordinary mix of otherworldly brilliance and just incredible humility and curiosity that I think makes Shannon such a fascinating figure.
The film is so famous now, A Beautiful Mind, but I think when I think of Shannon, I can easily imagine Another Beautiful Mind. And frankly, to me, this story would be much more interesting on the big screen than perhaps John Nash. It's really a fascinating story. You can't even give enough perspective as to the interest that he had, to the scope that it was. We're going to get into it in a second. The wearable computer, working with Ed Thorpe. It's just amazing. Let me bring up a bigger picture issue, though, that I'm kind of going to quote from your work a little bit here. And I think this will get people more into the idea of what he figured out. And this is quoting from your work. "What does information mean? It measures the uncertainty we overcome. It measures our chances of learning something we haven't yet learned. Where there is perfect certainty, there is no information. There is nothing to be said. That line right there, what a great line. Where there is perfect certainty, there is no information, there is nothing to be said. If we're all in the same room, we can see each other, we can talk, there's perfect certainty. But you and I are not in the same room. And that's just a...
Well, thanks. Again, all credit is to Shannon for coming up with that concept. But I'll tell you why it's important, I think, which is that when Shannon sits down to think about how to make the accurate transmission of information possible on the scale that he's thinking of, the first step that he stumbles upon is, how are we going to actually talk about information? How are we going to quantify information? How are we going to talk about information as if it's an objective, physical thing out there in the world, not some kind of fuzzy thing up in the clouds? And that's where Shannon invents the bit. And what the bit essentially is just like you said, it's a measure of surprise. It's a measure of uncertainty overcome. And the really simple, going back to the point of simplicity, analogy that Shannon comes up with to explain this is the idea of a coin flip. He says a coin flip is the most basic kind of information-bearing device. If you've got a coin that's got a 50-50 chance of coming up heads or tails, that is essentially equivalent to one bit of information. It's one completely random choice. Now, the interesting thing is that most of the messages we send aren't like random coins. Most of the messages we send are probabilistic because we have all sorts of rules built into our languages, built into our messages. In other words, when we send a picture, we don't send random static. When I speak to you, I don't just string together a bunch of random vowels and consonants. So what that means is that most of the messages we send are like weighted coins. They're not 50-50 coins. They convey somewhat less than entirely full surprise. And that's valuable both because thinking about information in this way, which is part of Shannon's insight, is that you can really get down to the nub of how to measure in bits the amount of information in anything, whether it's a picture or a movie or a song or a conversation or a book or a library or whatever. But also that once you think about the probability of one symbol following another, you can begin to develop those codes that are kind of the core of Shannon's practical accomplishment. These codes that both help us compress our messages so that you can say, download a sound file in a matter of seconds, and also the codes that build in redundancy so you protect transmissions from errors. So we're talking over Skype without all sorts of static and distortion creeping into the conversation. And it all starts by thinking about how surprising is a message really, and how can you control and manipulate that element of surprise to protect our conversation or to protect our information source.
And before you even get to the circuit board, the analog, the digital, and you kind of just went there with your answer, much of the great genius in Shannon was the basic human logic. I mean, before you even get to the math, it's like the logic. And it makes, when you go through his mind, which is you guys have done a great job of putting on paper, when you go through his mind to the extent that we can, and then you think about so much of modern society, there is just the way that he thought to approach problems. So much of incommunication, conflict, can be solved if we would all take a little bit from Claude Shannon.
I think that's right. He offers us a way of thinking about problems, and I think a way of thinking about our creative lives. And that's the other piece of this that I think we tend to miss. It's easy to look at the scale of his accomplishments and to say, oh, well, I can't do anything like that because I don't have his IQ points or anything. But I do think that part of what he offers to us is one of the things, I think, is to say, don't specialize. Claude Shannon allowed his curiosity to sort of roam free. He was a code breaker. He was a gambler. He was a tinkerer. He built robots. He was also, an incredible theoretical mathematician, but he also built devices and things that are still in museums to this day. And I think that we live in an era where it's really easy to pick your lane and to continue swimming in it for as long as you can. And there are books and articles and people who will recommend that that's what you got to do. That advice would have been completely lost on Shannon, who basically just allowed himself to follow wherever his curiosity took him. And then he just took it further than everyone else. But what was also incredible was he combined things from different fields. So Shannon is credited with being one of the first people to think about artificial intelligence. And he built a quote-unquote artificially intelligent robot mouse that became a kind of mid-20th century sensation.
Theseus.
It was Theseus, yeah. It was this device that he built in his spare time with his wife where he put built a maze and put a mouse in the middle, and they constructed a series of relays that would allow the mouse to find a piece of metallic cheese in the maze. Once the mouse had gone through that maze once, they could put the mouse back at the start of the maze and it would find its way through again. And you've got to remember, I mean, this is the early 1950s, and he's building these devices that anticipate so much of modern artificial intelligence because he's sort of laying that groundwork, but he also had exposure to all the necessary pieces. It's incredible to think of a guy who did theoretical work like information theory, spending his nights and weekends building a mouse maze. I mean, that's just something that even to his contemporaries, even to his friends, they always thought he was a little off kilter. They would see him playing with kids' toys. They would see him playing with pogo sticks or unicycles. And they would say, like, aren't you supposed to be sitting in an ivory tower somewhere, kind of thinking about things? And that, I think, is like the other great lesson of Shannon's life, besides the kind of push to learn as many things as you can and to sample different fields. It's also to just not have too much ego invested in the things that you're studying and learning. He just never really put his own ego into his work, and it's part of what I think what allowed him to go into so many different directions and then to combine those directions in such interesting ways.
You know, it's worth mentioning, too, for the audience out there, the mouse, and I guess I said it wrong at first, but Theseus, you must go watch the video because you guys do the great job of explaining it and getting into the nitty gritty. But that 7-minute video with Claude Shannon narrating, and it's so interesting too to watch his personality. You can see he's a very shy guy. Probably never did. I don't know if he ever did another video like that, but that 7 or 8 minute video is on YouTube right now. And it is one of the most fascinating things that you can see on YouTube, period.
Well, we certainly agree, and it's this incredible moment because just a few years before that, he has published the information theory paper. So in 1948, he publishes the information theory paper, and that earns him all kinds of acclaim within his field. Right after that, he's working on this mouse maze, and he brings it to his bosses at Bell Labs. And the board at Bell Labs was so impressed that they actually tried to, one guy yells out, well, this is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need at Bell Labs. We should put Claude Shannon on the board. And they had a heck of a time trying to kind of talk this guy down from that proposition. But it was interesting to think of someone who had this great theoretical achievement, and his next great achievement is an artificially intelligent mouse. And I think that it's one of those things that could have only sprung from a mind as curious and as interested in different things as Claude Shannon.
Yeah, one of the main lessons we learned about Shannon was that both in the environment he was at Bell Labs and MIT, and also to someone with his obvious intelligence, he was someone who just got a lot of freedom and a lot of leeway to follow his interests and do what he wants. And you might think, great, everyone wants more freedom at their job. And yet the tough side of that is that freedom can be scary. It means you don't get assigned problems to work on. You have to pick your problems. You have to pick your spots. You have to think about what puzzles are actually interesting and worth your time. And Shannon is just such a good model of not just how to solve problems, but how to creatively figure out what problems are worth solving and investigating in the first place. He's a really great model of how to deal with freedom, how to deal with the ability to choose your work and to choose what's worth your time. And he's someone who, for the length of his career, just did that really well. And that's one way he's inspiring to us.
Let me take you guys on a sidetrack for a moment. I expected when I went to the index, I figured, with where you guys had gone, and he's been a guest on my show, that's Bill Poundstone, the author of Fortune's Formula. And I see that there was, some influence from Bill's work in your work, naturally so. Speak to me, though, as you guys started this process, was there any one or two people that if they did not participate, I'm thinking myself, because I've done some books where if I didn't have a few people that said no and they wouldn't participate, there was probably going to be hard to get the work together. Were there people that were so critical here that you guys really brought out for the first time to give insights, or was this just a massive investigative report that frankly you guys were just smart enough to plug that niche that was not yet filled?
We approached Shannon and the biography as a biography, meaning the story of a person's life. There's been a lot written about Shannon's ideas. There's been, academic papers, 90,000 of them written based on his original paper. But we really wanted to get kind of under the skin. We wanted to understand, how does a person like this come to be? What were his childhood influences? Who were his mentors? What did he like to eat? What did he like to read? Where did he live? All of that. And so for us, part of what we did was we went out and talked to people, a lot of people who knew him and interacted with him. This book could not have come together without the participation of the Shannon family. We spoke to Claude Shannon's widow, Betty, who sadly just passed away 4 weeks ago. We spoke to his son and his daughter, Peggy and Andrew, and they were absolutely instrumental in giving us access to the Shannon that wasn't in the pages of journals or in museums. They gave us access to Shannon the dad and Shannon the husband. They gave us wonderful anecdotes about the times when he was playful. They told us a lot about how he passed away. He suffered from Alzheimer's, and it's a disease that ultimately took his life, and they gave us a window into that. This book could not have been written without their help and their support. They also were very generous in giving us many of the photographs that will be in the middle section of the book. And again, those are photos that have never been seen before because they were personal family album kind of photos, the sorts of things that stay tucked in attics. And they were kind enough to share those with us. This book would be a completely different book if they had said no. And, they did at the beginning. They were a little reluctant to talk to two non-technical, non-math people who stumbled on their dad's life. But over time, I think we demonstrated our interest in him, and they were willing to open up and help us.
So many people, when they think of genius, this level of genius, perhaps unfairly, they might immediately, and I brought it up earlier, they might go back to A Beautiful Mind, and they might have this feeling that so many of the upper echelon thinkers, perhaps they would have some type of other issue. For example, I had a Nobel Prize winner on my podcast, really, really smart guy, Vernon Smith. He's very famous because he openly talks about having Asperger's syndrome. But from what I can see with Shannon, and I think, again, people need to be aware that just because one has this intellect does not leave them just a completely normal person. And when I go through your work, there doesn't seem to be, beyond the fact that Shannon was brilliant and novel and so creative, he seems like a pretty nice, normal guy. I mean, it would have been a blast to hang out with, is what I can see, if he respected you and if he was willing to, you could raise the game and he could really keep his mind engaged. I think that'd be the caveat.
That's a completely accurate description of him. We have a line in the book, and I'm going to do that horrible author thing and quote myself, but we have a line where we say, we prefer our geniuses tortured. We want our greatest minds to bear the deepest scars. What's interesting is Shannon doesn't have that. There's no great crippling personal quality. There's nothing. He has a period in his 20s where, by all accounts, he is depressed. I mean, he goes through some depression, but it isn't the kind of major depressive episode that other geniuses struggle with. There's a war coming. He's trying to figure out whether he's going to be drafted. He goes through a divorce, and his professional life is still in flux. And so there's a combination of things that kind of give him this temperament, or this sort of depressive episode. But at the same time, he gets through it, and the rest of his life, it's not, I wouldn't say it's smooth sailing, because he's doing tough work in tough circumstances, but he doesn't have some sort of secret issue or a kind of debilitating disorder of any kind. He's a very genial, fun guy. If anything, he's a little shy. He's a little reticent. He is unwilling to kind of puff himself up. He gets invited to conferences and wins awards, and he'll often just turn down the invitations because he's not interested. He wants to keep doing his own thing. Most of the people we met who gotten to know Shannon, they were in one of two camps. Either they were friends who just got to know him as like the guy who barbecued and then did math, or the guy who went running with him and did math, or they got to know him as starstruck graduate students who couldn't believe that somebody like Shannon would be willing to talk to them. And that was another piece of this, is that, that he had a kind of small group of people who became his acolytes, and he was willing to give them time. He invited them over to his house. He spent time with them. And so these people are left with these incredible stories of interacting with the person who founded their field. It'd be a little bit like if you were a physicist and you got to hang out with Isaac Newton. And so that to us, it's actually one of the more endearing qualities of Shannon, that yes, he has this incredible work. He's a genius. He has accolades to prove it, but he's also the kind of guy that you probably could have just sat out on a back porch with and talked about anything.
You guys brought up Bell Labs in the beginning. I think you said imagine it as Google and Apple combined. I want you to explain a little bit more of the atmosphere there, the freedom to create, the ability to go down your own path. And I love this great line, and I'm not sure if it was from a piece of corporate communications or whatnot, but Bell Labs was described as letting their people go work on something that might someday help on communications, might someday. And of course, the government's involved here too. So the government's allowing some freedom here as well. But that might someday. Today, so many people go through their life 9 to 5. Claude Shannon was a might someday guy.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I would say, first of all, is that Bell Labs was free of this kind of short-termism that I think sort of limits people's horizon when they're working in a corporate environment like that. Bell Labs obviously was in unique circumstances. It was profiting from this, federally guaranteed telephone monopoly, but that minute had a tremendous amount of cash to throw around. And then one of the things it could do is invest in might someday projects, extremely long time window projects. And it could invest in prestige projects. Things like Claude Shannon's information theory turn out, as the Skype conversation shows, to be hugely fruitful decades down the road. We saw that in the 90s, the kind of codes for information transmission that Shannon predicted might exist ended up linking the Voyager satellites back to Earth. That's something that Shannon never imagined might happen in 1948 when he wrote this paper, but it was one of those might someday kind of payoffs. And Bell Labs was able to invest in these sort of prestige projects, things from the development of the communication satellite to investigations of people like Clinton Davison, who also was a colleague of Shannon's at Bell Labs, who worked on things like radiation, subatomic particles. This idea that Bell Labs was the kind of culture that encouraged, I think one of its employees said, the operations of genius, just putting a bunch of smart people together, giving them some whiteboards and blackboards and letting them sort it out. It was also a playful environment. Obviously it was the 40s and 50s, so people called each other by their last names and went to work in suits and all that. But at the same time, Shannon tells stories about building at work a rock, paper, scissors machine and having a tournament which would face off against various others of his colleagues and see whether they could beat the rock, paper, scissors machine that Shannon had built. Shannon would juggle and ride a unicycle down the Bell Labs hallways. So essentially it was the kind of place where people could pursue projects without the next quarter hanging over their heads. And I know there are all sorts of economic reasons why people working in sort of corporate environments don't have that luxury because of the short-termism in our economy. And I think that's the example of Shannon in the other direction shows why short-termism can be so harmful. I think of Bell Labs as a place that's just, it takes something like Google's 20% time and just blows it up to exponential proportions. Bell Labs is doing some really concrete stuff on maintaining the country's telegraph and telephone networks. But as a result of that, it also harbored people, like Claude Shannon, who could sit down and think about basic questions like, what's the nature of information? What am I doing when I send a message? What does it mean to communicate? Even though there was no money in it in the short term for anyone in that immediate circle. And we're lucky that he had the freedom to do that.
I can think back, and this is in no way to toot any kind of horn of mine, because this is so bare bones basic, but I can remember in the 1990s, I put up my first website. I hired a developer. It bombed out, whatever. But if I didn't figure out how to code myself, and I had no training at all, we wouldn't be talking. I had to kind of put something up, or it was sink or swim. That's small potatoes compared to what Shannon was able to do. And I'm just kind of giving that as kind of an analogy, but he was taking this genius of having this symbolic calculus, this rigorous logic, the math, combining it with the ability to design electric circuits. This was not normal at his time, was it?
No, absolutely not. And again, that kind of goes to Shannon's ability to put together fields that people didn't think were related at all. When you're talking about Shannon's work on logic and circuits, that goes back to a paper that he wrote when he was 21 that is separate from his information theory paper, but it's actually, Walter Isaacson called it the basic idea behind all digital computers. That basic idea is that digital switches, ones and zeros, can do all of the operations that we think of when we think of Boolean logic, the logic of ands and ors and nots and so on, and that you can simulate ands and ors by opens and closed switches. And if you could do that, that means that any kind of machine with switches, whether it's a computer or a mechanical device with open and shut kind of electrical switches, can evaluate logical statements, which is the very, very basic concept behind making a machine that could someday think, or as we say, kind of do an imitation of a brain. Again, Shannon would not have been able to put those two disciplines together if he hadn't been so promiscuously curious, if he hadn't been someone who thought about the basics of logic, and also was someone who tinkered on these very early, clanky, room-sized mechanical computers. And then, one day, we're not sure when the light bulb went off, but he thought, well, actually, this thing that I'm doing in logic looks a lot like, by analogy, this thing that I'm doing when I tinker with these electrical switches. I wonder how far I can take that. And it turns out that it was not just this paper he wrote at 21 was not just, it's been called the most important master's thesis of all time. It was also one of the basic ideas, along with Alan Turing, that makes computers themselves possible. And this is a thing that happened because Shannon just was drawing from so many different buckets. He could put so many different fields together in unexpected kinds of ways. Anyone, we think, that had been in those, had a foot in those two kinds of fields might have made that connection. But it's telling that Shannon was the one to do it, because there were very few people who had both of those interests simultaneously. There were logic people, and there were computers and switching people at the same time. But until Shannon came along, there were very few people who happened to be both. And that was enormously to his benefit and to ours as well.
Let's speak to his creativity and how he got there. And I would think that a big part of that was he devised a life that insulated him from criticism, as far as I can tell in your work. I would love for you to expand on that idea. Look, in any field of life, if you're successful and you reach achievement, there are going to be critics, there's going to be competitors. Much of that seemed to be very distant for Shannon, or it was not something that encompassed him. And I'm really, I don't know, the word's not jealous, but I think even at my age right now, I look at his story and I say, gosh, it's worth for the rest of my life to some degree to try and find a way to insulate from criticism, because his brilliance also was knowing that all that criticism didn't help. There was an opportunity cost to his own thinking.
It's one of the qualities of Shannon's that's hardest to emulate, but probably the most valuable, which is he didn't allow critics to get to him, and he didn't allow envy to shape the kind of work he did. There really was a kind of purity of curiosity. He went where he wanted to go, and he was smart enough to know that once certain pieces of work were done, they were finished, and he knew he was right, and it didn't really matter what critics said. And then by the time the critics came around, he had moved on to other fields of interest. It's one of these things. There's a part of it that's probably just something in his nature, that's something about him just keeps him from having that kind of response to criticism. I think part of it too is just that he just knew that he had done the work to be right about the things that he was publishing and saying and building. And so he had confidence that came from that kind of intellectual authority. People forget he writes the information theory, he publishes the information theory paper in 1948, but it's 10 years of work that goes into it, right? And so he spends 10 years, and this is basically as a what we would call like a side hustle, that at nights and on weekends and it breaks during the day, he is working on kind of the seminal paper, the Magna Carta of the information age, over 10 years. But in that 10-year time, he knew that that he had achieved something. He knew that what he had done was correct. And then the few critics that came and came after his mathematics, he was able to brush them aside. And again, by that point, he had moved on to artificial intelligence. He had moved on to different computing projects, and he had become a professor. And so he manages to insulate himself in a way that's really powerful, and I think can be really useful as a model for all of us, because he's confident in what he's built, and then he's curious about his next endeavor, and the next endeavor's started before the critics can get to him.
Let's talk about one of those next endeavors, because this is such a crazy story of one man. The endeavors never stop, and they seem to not be connected. Ed Thorp, a brilliant man in his own right. Blackjack, 21, beating the casinos. I don't know if Ed Thorpe's story would be exactly the same without Claude Shannon, though. Why don't you guys tell some of that story?
Yeah, this part cracked us up. We spoke to Ed Thorpe a little bit because obviously he's still around and writing. It begins when Ed Thorpe writes a paper on the mathematics of how to win at blackjack, and he comes to Claude Shannon for advice. Again, when Claude Shannon is a very eminent figure in the field, and Ed Thorpe essentially asked Claude Shannon, "How am I going to get this published?" And Shannon says to him, "Well, you need to catch your title first of all." So the main thing is that they turn to, after they start collaborating, Ed Thorpe asked Shannon, "Well, now we can think about the mathematics of blackjack. What about the mathematics of roulette? How do we go to a casino and actually rig the game of roulette in our favor?" So Shannon says, why don't you come over to my house? Well, at this point, Shannon had this enormous house that he had built for himself or renovated for himself, a bit of a drive away from the MIT campus. And he had this, what people called the toy room, or his kids just called Dad's room, which was this 2-story warehouse/engineering room with all of his gadgets and engineering projects and machine tables and so on. And they bought a regulation-sized roulette wheel, and they started figuring out how can we calculate the probability where the ball's going to end up based on where the ball gets dropped into the machine. And they figured out that you can time this thing if you would build a basic computing device that you could somewhere conceal on your person, and then it could transmit the answer in essentially on a scale of pitches. So you would hit the button of the wearable computer to signal when the ball is dropped into the roulette machine, and then the wearer of this device had an earpiece, and based on the intensity of the pitch, you could guess whether it was going to end up on red and black and so on, and they could eliminate parts of the roulette wheel and essentially get it down to a quarter and then to an eighth of the roulette wheel as to where the ball's going to end up. And once you can do that, obviously, you have this huge advantage over the house, and you can reliably make a ton of money at roulette. So they brought it to the casinos in Vegas. They road tested it a couple of times. Shannon, Thorpe, and their wives, who took turns acting as lookouts. There was one close call when I believe Thorpe was at the roulette table, and someone saw the speaker peeking out of his ear. This was the days before earbuds, and they freaked out because they thought an insect was crawling out of his ear. So he had to go to the bathroom and fix that. So they had a good deal of success with the casinos, but of course the casinos at the time were, very many of them were controlled by the mafia. And if they weren't controlled by the mafia, the cops would get on you. And although Ed Thorpe is very vehement that this was technically not against the rules, it would have been really difficult if Shannon and Ed Thorpe had been caught by a pit boss with this concealed computer and earbud on them, having to explain what the hell they were doing in there and how they were gaming the system of roulette. They probably would have gotten worked over pretty badly.
You know, I had Mike Aponte on this podcast years back. He was the team leader for the original MIT blackjack team, and he spoke to me about being taken into a back room in Louisiana, and he was very concerned for a period of time that something bad was going to happen.
Yeah, so Shannon and Thorpe had that same thought, and although they never really got threatened, they figured that once they had made their point and built their wearable computer, they were probably going to count that as a win and not try to actually wring a bunch of money out of casinos, which was probably for the best, or maybe Shannon's story might have ended a little earlier. But it was one of the early wearable computers that Ed Thorpe says that, in fact, it was, in a sense, it's the predecessor of the Fitbit, the Apple Watch, and then so on. And there was a computer that could do basic tasks that you wore. And this was all in the interest of beating the casino at roulette.
You know, the audience should understand, too, with a guy like this, his interest, his achievements, we're just being topical in this conversation. I mean, really, each one of these things that we're talking about, each one of these endeavors today, we could speak for hours about each one in the nitty gritty. But for that, people are going to have to go do a little reading. I would like to let you guys talk a little bit about the entrepreneurship of co-authors. I happen to have written a few books. I actually might be doing a co-author soon, so perhaps I'm going to learn something right now. But I'd like to know how you guys came at this in terms of a team, because this seems like, look, there's competition in life. Why would Jimmy and Rob want to give co-credit? I mean, what was the genesis of two guys approaching this?
So we've known each other for a long time. We were both in college together and became friends. And this is actually our second co-written book. The first book was a biography of an ancient Roman senator whose name was Cato. We just had a great time working on that project together. And I think, companies are co-founded in academia. Papers are co-written. And it just seemed to us that this isn't anything too strange about co-writing a book. In fact, one of the great things, it does a few great things, I think. One is you're accountable to someone who isn't yourself. You have to produce because someone else is producing. The second is that I think Rob and I bring different strengths to the table, and we complement each other very nicely. So there are things that I don't know how to do that Rob does, and there are things that Rob doesn't know how to do that I can do. And I think, partnerships exist for that reason. And I think writing partnerships can exist, can operate in much the same way. And the final thing is, writing a book, especially one as research heavy as ours and as interview heavy as ours, is just an extraordinary amount of work. I mean, and there's a lot of different moving pieces. And so in a way, you're sharing the labor. When it works, it can produce an incredible result that I'm not sure either of us could have gotten to the end product on this book alone. Just given the scale of the effort. There are some favorite books of mine that are co-written. Walter Isaacson and Evan Thomas have a book called The Wise Men and Six Friends in the World They Made, which is a really wonderful read, and they co-wrote that when they were younger. And so I think there are examples for us and models for us of co-writing, but it does actually offer you some structural advantages for the same reason that I think people go out and find co-founders for their companies.
I was going to say, it just makes the whole thing seem less intimidating. You have to climb halfway up the mountain instead of all the way to the top. And I think Jimmy's absolutely right when he talks about division of labor. For instance, Jimmy's more of a people person. He could take the lead on a lot of the interviews, reaching out to the Shannon family, conducting those conversations. I don't mind going to the Library of Congress and spending several days digging through the archives of Shannon's papers and his mentor's papers. If this were a single written book, you'd have to have someone that could combine both those skills. But fortunately, we can each, I guess this goes against our message of specializing, but we can each drill down on those fields of writing and researching a book that we're better at and more comfortable at. And I think it makes the whole product more well-rounded.
Hey, let me ask a practical question on this. When I do a book, it's me, and then I turn the draft into the publisher. At that moment in time, with the editor on a very small basis, because they don't make that many changes, that's where my back and forth takes place. And I really enjoy that. But practically, and I almost can't write a book this way, I need to do it in Microsoft Word so I can use track changes, or in Adobe's product with track changes, something to that effect. Is that what you guys are doing at the more final stages? Is one person taking the draft and going through and then giving it back to the other for feedback? How does that process take place?
For both of our books, what we've done is we've just divvied up the chapters, and then we've proceeded through the chapters, and then we swap as soon as chapters are done. I'll take chapter 1, Rob will take chapter 2, and we'll share the drafts as soon as we're done to make sure that we can kind of get our voices to align. Part of this, too, is just finding somebody that you co-author well with. I think Rob and I have similar tastes, similar interests. We admire similar authors. For us, there's a high degree of the Venn diagram has a high degree of overlap. And so what we do very practically is we pick our chapters, we swap, we edit, and then we go back and we continue to refine. That obviously there are dips and there are peaks and valleys. You sometimes find that you're not the right person to do a chapter, and you can pass it off. You can trade. There are sections where I knew that Rob was working on a piece of research that fit into a chapter I was writing, so I would just sort of say, leave a comment, Rob, can you fill this in? We would each highlight things that the other was supposed to look at. If I had a great quote from an interview that I knew fit into one of Rob's chapters, I could go and drop it right in. But it's actually not as practically complicated as it seems if you just split up the chapters and tackle each one.
It's cool stuff. I mean, I can see as I'm asking these questions and I'm imagining myself and working with someone, it's pretty cool that you guys have found that nice connection to make things go faster too. I mean, you get more brain power in on it, and you get there faster.
Well, and the other thing is you kind of can check your own biases, right? And you have somebody who can in the moment correct your mistakes. We all have tendencies in our writing or in our creative work that we're not aware of, and someone else can come along and just point those out. And normally, that's your editor, but it's really nice to have somebody who's sort of a de facto editor as you're working on the product. Part of the other thing, and I'm sure you've experienced this, is that writing can be a really lonely process. You're sitting in a room by yourself with your own thoughts and your research and a laptop, And part of one of the great values of co-writing a book is you're spending a lot of time together. You spend a lot of time talking things out loud. You'll imagine a scene and you'll sort of talk about what it should look like. You'll come across a fact and you'll have to decide whether or not it's worth including. And you can talk that out in the moment with somebody. We find that to be as an enjoyable part of actually putting the book together.
Hey, do you guys have, I do, I've not looked at these, but for every book that I've been involved in, I have the track changes doc back to the inception of the first draft. Do you guys have every iteration along the way saved somewhere?
It is all in Google Docs, and I never want to see it.
Yeah, ditto.
It's nice to know that we have it, but you don't want to see it. Maybe the grandkids dig through it in the future, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, what was going on here?"
I get scared to even look at the proposal that we submitted to our publisher because I know that the book's come so far. It's like I cringe when I see something from early on. But that's the nature of this kind of work.
Guys, I appreciate you coming on today. The book, A Mind at Play, How Claude Shannon Invented the Information Age. If you don't read it, you have some type of mental defect. Is that a proper endorsement? I don't know. Am I calling people names if they don't read your book?
When
Something
the
like that.
comes out, that'll be on the cover.
If you do not read this book, you have a mental defect. Hey, guys, is there a website we can send people to?
I think the easiest site is the place that most people buy their books, which is Amazon. And if you go on Amazon and you type in either the name Claude Shannon or the title A Mind at Play, you will be able to purchase the book. We just want to get this story into as many hands as possible.
Great stuff, guys. And I would have a sneaky suspicion that there's the potential for those that are paying attention in Hollywood. There's the potential for something to happen here. My gosh, look, if people love The Big Short, they love Moneyball, they like The Beautiful Mind, how could they not like this story on the big screen? It's impossible.
So who's going to play Claude Shannon?
You guys got to figure that one out. Best of luck on that journey.
Well, let's hope we get to do it. That'd be incredible.
Hey guys, I appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Great
you.
to talk.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.